everyone. Welcome back to Weston the Historian. It's now 2026. So to celebrate, I would like to go back and look at all the books that I read in 2025. And then I want to talk about what my goals are for this upcoming year. So just to start off, I started the year by finishing On the Soul by Aristotle. I started it in 2024 around Christmas, and then January of 2025 I finished it, and I enjoyed it. I will probably reread it in the future because I don't have a lot of thoughts on it now. And my memory of it is fuzzy, but maybe I should write down some excerpts I thought were interesting to refresh my memory. Then, after that, I read and finished the book of Psalms and the Bible. My whole life I've been reading the Bible, and the book of Psalms was always one of my favorite books, so I read and reread it. But anyway, moving on, I read Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. I read that for school, and if I'm being honest, I wasn't a big fan. I am not a fan of kind of revisionist writing. I don't like when people take ancient Greek myths and try to bring them back, but change details or change characters, or what if it was about this instead of this? Because every time it's going through a modern lens and they totally miss the point of the story because they're trying to do a totally different story, and I don't like that. Next, I read Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. That was good. It was boring, but it was good. I think, I don't know, he's just talking about what's virtuous, what's not virtuous. It's a very dry read, but it's good. I think it's worth reading at least once in your life. Then after that, I finished From Dawn to Decadence, and that book took me a long, long time to read. It's a very long book, but it is probably one of the my favorite books that I read that last year. I just thought it was a real incredible read. And it was so interesting. There just was a whole lot of things that were talked about. It basically covers the history of Europe from maybe around the Renaissance to now, but it still would go back and it would talk about the Middle Ages and other things. I thought it was just really, really interesting. And yeah, and then after that, I read French Painting Before the Revolution by M.L. Frere Carole and Francis Kavanagh or something. That was fun. It was pretty. It was a very pretty book. It just showed, Baroque and Rococo art, the kinds of things that were being made before the Revolution. And I thought it was quite cool, and it talked a little bit about the history and showed a lot of examples, and I thought it was quite cool to look at and to read. Then moving on, I read The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. That I thought was really fantastic. That was, I believe, the first time I've actually read Nietzsche, and I just thought it was an incredible read. The whole Apollo Dionysus split is very interesting to me. And I don't know, I just thought it was really interesting. Then next I read a book called Chivalry, The Path of Love. And I don't actually know, I think it was an anonymous author or something. It was very weird. I don't remember seeing an author tied to it, but it was quite an interesting read. It was one of those reads that's very short, so I think I probably read it in an afternoon. And in the moment, I thought it was cool, and the binding was cool, and then the inside of the book was really cool. There's a lot of pretty images. It was a very pretty book. So for anyone who's interested in chivalry and where that originated, I would suggest reading that. Then I read The Beau in the Club by Julius Evola. I don't really have any thoughts on that. I wanted to know more about this Julius Evola figure and what he has to say about the world, so I read that, and it was interesting. In some places, I was like, yeah, this is really interesting, and in other places, I just thought it was so convoluted and ridiculous in some places, and I was like, I just don't even know what you're talking about. But anyway, moving on. I also read First Principles by Thomas E. Ricks, um, which was, if I'm being honest, a little boring, but it was kind of interesting. I think it's interesting that he notes that Thomas Jefferson was one of the few founding fathers who looked more to ancient Greece than Rome, um, which doesn't totally surprise me, but it was kind of interesting. I mean, it's just talking about the classical education, and I think one takeaway from that book, which I thought was interesting, which I didn't expect, was that Scotland was kind of seen as like an academic center. Um, that for some reason I just didn't know about, and I thought that was really interesting. They talked about how the founding fathers took a lot of influence from Scottish writers and academics and whatnot. Um, I thought that was interesting. Then moving on, I read Patriotism by Yukio Mishima, and I actually remember the exact place where I was. I was picking up a suit for prom, and they were taking a long time, so I decided I'll read a book. So I read Patriotism by Yukio Mishima, and I finished it before they even got to me to give me my suit, tuxedo rather. So those were weird circumstances to read and finish a book, but I thought it was a wonderful read. It had probably the most nauseating description of death that I can remember reading. It was very graphic. It was very graphic, very descriptive. Mishima had a way with words. I think he was a great writer, strong writer, in the sense that like you can really visualize what he's talking about, um, for better or worse, as you will see if you read Patriotism, which, in my opinion, was a wonderful read, though it was a little graphic. But then moving on, I read Dionysus Dithyrambs by Friedrich Nietzsche, which I will have to reread because I felt like I didn't really connect with any of the poems. These are basically Nietzsche's poems, and none of them really stuck out to me as particularly interesting. But I really want to reread it because I don't know. I like what I've read from Nietzsche, and I like poetry, so I thought, oh, poetry by Nietzsche, that sounds like it would be cool. And then I didn't like it, and I think I want to just reread it because I think it could be interesting if I go in again with an open mind. And anyway, moving on. I read Love Poems, which was from the Everyman's Library Pocket Poems, which is like this brand that I really, really like. They just release all these like little poetry collections from all these different poets, and I think it's wonderful. And Love Poems, I thought was wonderful. It had just all these different poems. One thing which I really learned is that I really like the poetry of Christina Rossetti. I didn't even know who she was before, so it introduced me to some new poets I had never heard of, and I was really happy I discovered because I I enjoyed every single poem by her that was in that book. There were some poems I was like not as interested in, but every time I saw a poem, I was like, wow, this is riveting. It was every single time it was Christina Rossetti, and I was like, okay, well, I need to read more of her poems if she's this good of a poet. Then anyway, moving on. Songs of Innocence and Experience by William Blake. I may have to reread this again because I didn't like it very much when I read it. And I think the reason is because it was very formulaic. Each poem kind of had the same style. It was like each poem read in the same, it was the same rhyme scheme in every poem. And when you're reading it all together, it just feels like you're kind of just, all the poems kind of bleed together and you can't differentiate any of them. And they're so similar that, like, they're too similar for it to really be harmonious. Like, you can have poems that are similar and it feels harmonious in a collection, but they should still have some differentiation. And I remember reading it and feeling like every single poem, it feels like I'm reading the same poem over and over and over again. And I just didn't really enjoy it, which made me sad because I thought I would. Anyway, I read the Iliad by Homer, and I enjoyed it. However, I was reading a prose translation, and I don't remember who the translator was, but I just remember thinking, I really wish I'd read the poem of like a poetic translation instead. But anyway, then I read The Raven and Other Poems by Edgar Allan Poe. It was a little collection of poems by Edgar Allan Poe, including, of course, The Raven, and I really enjoyed it. I like Edgar Allan Poe, I always have. I've always been really interested in his work, and that little collection introduced me to some poems that I hadn't heard of before, and I just thought it was really interesting. And I really like his poetry quite a bit. I like The Raven quite a lot. Um, Moving on, I read The Viking Spirit, An Introduction to Norse Mythology and Religion by Daniel McCoy. And that was very, very, very interesting. It was, it's about Norse religion and mythology, which I thought was quite interesting because I feel like most books I've read which discuss Norse mythology don't actually talk about the religion. They talk more about just the stories and the gods, but they don't talk about the rituals and they don't talk about the traditions of the people who actually practice this religion. Because I think, I don't know, a lot of the people who are interested in stuff like this seem to think of it as like fables or stories, and they kind of forget like there is a human element to this. People actually believed in this and they worshiped these gods at one point, and of course there are neo-pagans who today worship these gods. So I don't know, I think it's silly to kind of focus only on the stories as opposed to the living experience of the people who believed in this. So I thought it was a wonderful read in that it really delved into the actual religious practices of the Norse. Um, Moving on, I read Path to the Gods, Anglo-Saxon Paganism for Beginners by Swain Wodening. It was terrible. If I'm being quite honest, I felt like I learned some things. Um, the the very fact that I did learn things that I didn't know about before makes me go, okay, this was an interesting read, but I would not recommend it to anyone. It's so repetitive and terrible, terribly written. It's I don't know, it's just terribly written, and apparently the author's like a weirdo or something. Like, I don't know. I think I heard he was like a pedophile or something. I don't know, but it, like it just was terribly written, and I don't know. I mean, of course you can separate the author from the work, but just it was not a good read. But I learned some things, and I still remember the things I learned. So kudos for that. Then moving on, I read Human, All Too Human by Friedrich Nietzsche. I thought it was a great read. It was probably a bit strange that I decided to tackle such a huge work because it's a very long. It was Human, All Too Human in both volumes. The second volume is not called Human, All Too Human, but it was good. It was very, very good. I thought it was very solid. Um, it is something that I would definitely reread. And I don't know, I thought there was a lot of interesting uh, insights into the world and how humans work and human nature in this book. So I enjoyed it thoroughly. Then Moving on, I decided to read more Julius Evola, so I decided to read Metaphysics of War, which I preferred over the other book. I thought it was more comprehensible. Um, Still a little schizo, but it was interesting. It was an interesting read. Um, I think if anyone asked me, like, hey, I've heard of this traditionalist guy, Julius Evola, what should I read? I would tell him, I think you should read Metaphysics of War. I think it's kind of an interesting read. Then, anyway, moving on. I read selected poems of Ezra Pound. So I've always thought Ezra Pound was quite an interesting figure. So I was excited to read this, and I liked the poems quite a bit. Um, I thought they were very solid. I thought they were very interesting. Some of them went a little over my head. He's kind of writing to an audience who's a lot more educated than me and probably most people. So I don't know. There was a lot of references that he made that I just didn't get. He sometimes likes to randomly switch into writing in Greek or Latin or Italian or some other language. So I don't know. I'm gonna have to become bilingual, trilingual in order to reread Ezra Pound, but um, still very interesting. And I like his style. He feels free. It feels like he's writing very freely. He's not following a strict formula, and I like that a lot. Then I read Poems Bewitched and Haunted. It was also from that Everyman's Library collection, and I thought it was great. I preferred the love poems. I just thought a lot of the poems were stronger, and it wasn't just the theme. I felt like the poets that were included were better poets in the love poems. But I still enjoyed reading Poems Bewitched and Haunted. I read it over during autumn, and that was nice reading something autumny during autumn. But I don't know. Then I read Leaves of Grass, Deathbed Edition by Walt Whitman, and I can now say quite confidently that that is probably my favorite book ever, and certainly my favorite poetry collection. I think Walt Whitman just was an incredible writer. I love his the freedom in how he wrote. I love the topics he wrote about. I just love his poems. He had a real enthusiasm and a real patriotism and a real optimism, specifically around America, but just life in general and humans. And it's just kind of exceptional because I feel like you don't see that in poetry so much, and you don't see that in other people so much. And I thought it was a great read, and it was very memorable, and I would reread it 100 times. But yeah, anyway, moving on. I read The Crimson Veil by John Slaughter. I thought it was a good read. It was kind of like a southern noir thing. It was like noir detective kind of thing, but set in the deep south, like right after World War II. Um, I thought it was a fine read. I think it was a fun read. It was an interesting read. Uh, I don't have too much to say about it because it maybe didn't click with me as well as it might with other readers, but I thought it was good. Then I read George Washington, A Brief Biography by William MacDonald. This was a very brief read. I completed it at a coffee shop. I read and finished it at a coffee shop. I started it, and it was good. I mean, there's not a whole lot to say. It was just talking about George Washington's life, and I'm sure if you're watching this and you're an American, you probably know George Washington and his life. So, I don't know. I thought it was interesting. But anyway, going on, I read Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats by T.S. Eliot. I had no idea this existed until recently, and I was really thrilled to find this out. It's basically a poetry collection about cats, written by T.S. Eliot, and I thought it was wonderful. And I read it once more in just one sitting, and I'm glad I did. I thought it was really a fun read. And I would definitely read it again, as with some of the others. But then after that, I was like, okay, I need to read more T.S. Eliot. So I read his four quartets, which were great. Maybe not as fun as his cat poems, but still great. Then after that, I read Man and Technics, A Contribution to a Philosophy of Life by Oswald Spengler, um, which I thought was quite good. Um, I don't have a whole lot to say about it, but I thought it was quite good. And yeah, then I finished Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times by H.W. Brands. That book took me a long time to finish because I finished it close to the end of the year. And when I started it, I was still a senior in high school. So it must have been sometime in the spring or early summer. And yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think Andrew Jackson is just a fascinating figure, one of the most fascinating presidents we've ever had. So I really enjoyed reading that. And then I closed out the year by finishing the Poetic Edda, translated by Jackson Crawford. And I thought it was wonderful. I thought each poem was really interesting. I studied kind of how the poems were written, and I was like, that's really interesting, and I kind of want to see if I can model that in my own poetry, because I write poetry, if you did not know that. But yeah, so thought those were interesting. And now my vision for next year is to read more books. My goal is to read like 5 books a month, which may be unrealistic, but we'll see. That's my goal. But anyway, don't have a whole lot more to say, so I'll close out the video. Thank you and goodbye.